Ubuntu 26.04 LTS is here, and I think the most useful way to look at this release is not to ask whether it is new. Of course it is new. The better question is whether it is actually better in the ways that matter, and whether it is better enough to justify upgrading right now. Because if you are already on Ubuntu 24.04 LTS, this is not a tiny step. You're jumping across the changes from 24.10, 25.04, 25.10, and then the final 26.04 release itself. That means new desktop behavior, new default applications, a more Wayland-centered experience, different update and privacy controls, and some hardware and gaming improvements that are genuinely interesting. But it also means more moving parts and more opportunities for something in your current setup to get a little weird. So this video is not another preview, and it is definitely not just Ubuntu released. Here is the wallpaper, job done. I want to answer 3 practical questions. Job done. I want to answer 3 practical questions. First, what changed that regular people will actually notice within the first hour? Second, what could break or at least annoy you if you upgrade from an existing system? And third, who should install Ubuntu 26.04 now, and who should calmly sit on 24.04 for a bit longer? There is good news here. Ubuntu 26.04 LTS brings GNOME 50, better scaling behavior, a cleaner way to manage startup apps, a newer desktop app stack, stronger Wayland positioning, better dual boot handling, and the new NTSYNC driver for Wine and Proton workloads. On paper, that is a very solid release, but there is also a less comfortable side to it. Ubuntu Desktop now assumes a Wayland-only session. The recommended memory requirement has crept up to 6 GB for a comfortable experience. Some long familiar defaults are gone, and if your workflow depends on PPAs, third-party packages, or old X11 habits, this is the kind of upgrade where you want to slow down and think before you click anything. So let's do this properly. Let's start with the changes you will actually see on the desktop, because some of them are good quality of life improvements, and some of them may be more disruptive than the marketing line suggests. The biggest day-to-day change in Ubuntu 26.04 LTS is that this desktop finally feels like the result of several releases landing together, instead of one flashy feature carrying the whole story. And the headline there is GNOME 50. Now, if you are expecting some dramatic visual redesign, that is not really what this is. The better way to describe it is refinement. Ubuntu has moved from GNOME 46 to GNOME 50 across this cycle, and the things you are most likely to notice are workflow improvements. One of the nicest examples is Startup App Control. You can now set an application to start automatically after login directly in Settings under Apps. That sounds small, but it removes one of those annoying little pieces of friction that used to push people toward extra tools or terminal commands. Then there is fractional scaling. GNOME has been tightening this up, and Ubuntu says the scaling factors are now optimized to minimize blur. That matters because blurry fractional scaling has been one of those things Linux users have learned to tolerate rather than enjoy, especially on laptops and mixed DPI setups. So if you are on a display that never felt quite right before, this release may genuinely feel more polished. Ubuntu also changes a lot of the default desktop applications. Papers replaces events for PDFs. Loop replaces Eye of GNOME for images. Tixis replaces GNOME Terminal. Showtime replaces Totem for video playback. If you do a fresh install, that means the default experience is more modern right away. If you are upgrading, it means Ubuntu may feel familiar and slightly unfamiliar at the same time. Not broken, just different enough that muscle memory gets tested for a few days. There are also smaller changes that matter more than they sound. Sysprof is installed by default now, which is useful if you want to profile performance issues. The old tracker minus indexer has moved to local search, and that stack has been updated quite a bit. Even the thumbnailing pipeline for audio and video has changed, using newer GStreamer-based components that are supposed to do a better job of picking useful preview frames. And then there is the bigger architectural shift. Ubuntu Desktop is now effectively Wayland-only at the session level. GNOME shell itself is no longer running as an Xorg session here. Legacy X11 apps can still run through X-Wayland, so this is not the same as saying X11 software suddenly stops working. But it is Ubuntu making a very clear statement about where the desktop is going. For some people, that is overdue. For others, especially if you still rely on older desktop behaviors, remote tools, niche utilities, or very specific multi-monitor habits, that will be one of the first things you want to test carefully. The interesting part is that Ubuntu is also saying NVIDIA systems now fully support Wayland. That is a bigger deal than it would have been a couple of years ago, because NVIDIA and Wayland used to be the combination that made Linux desktop users reach for coffee, patience, and a backup plan. So if that experience has finally settled down for most normal users, Ubuntu 26.04 gets credit for shipping at a better moment in the Linux graphics stack. In other words, the desktop changes are real. They are not revolutionary in one single screenshot, but they are noticeable in how the system behaves. And that is exactly why the next question matters so much. Does the underlying hardware and performance story actually justify the heavier feel of this release? Now let's talk about the part that often decides whether a release feels modern or just more demanding, and that is the hardware and performance story. First, Ubuntu 26.04 LTS raises the expectation for what counts as a comfortable desktop. The official guidance for Ubuntu Desktop is now a 2 GHz dual-core processor, 6 GB of RAM, and 25 GB of storage. That does not mean it will refuse to run on lighter hardware. It means Canonical is being more honest about what kind of system delivers a decent experience with the full desktop stack. And I think that matters because Ubuntu has sometimes had this reputation of being the default Linux choice for almost any machine. In 2026, that is only partly true. If you are on older hardware, especially something with 2 to 4 GB of memory, Ubuntu proper is no longer the safest recommendation. At that point, a lighter flavor like Ubuntu or Lubuntu makes more sense, and Canonical is effectively admitting that in the documentation. On newer hardware though, there are some worthwhile improvements. Power Profiles Manager has been improved, especially for newer AMD hardware with better optimization behavior and better battery awareness. So on laptops, particularly AMD-based laptops, there is a reasonable chance Ubuntu 26.04 feels more sensible in how it balances performance and battery life. Media acceleration also gets a quiet but important bump. Hardware-accelerated video encoding and decoding through VA API is now enabled by default for AMD and Intel users. If you do browser playback, screen recording, video work, or just generally care about smoother media handling with less CPU waste, that is one of those changes you may not notice directly, but you will notice the system feels less clumsy. Then there's the ARM story. Ubuntu now has an official generic ARM64 desktop image, including initial enablement for Snapdragon X Elite devices. I would not present that as mission accomplished, because early hardware enablement is never the same thing as everything works beautifully, but it does matter. Ubuntu is clearly trying to be taken seriously on newer ARM desktop and laptop hardware, and that is strategically important. For dual boot users, Ubuntu 26.04 also improves the install experience around BitLocker protected Windows systems. That sounds boring until you remember how many people still run Windows and Linux side by side, and how often dual boot setups become the reason an otherwise interested user gives up. If Ubuntu can make that path less fragile, that is a real win. And now the bit gamers will care about. Ubuntu includes the NTSYNC driver, which is designed to emulate Windows NT synchronization primitives and improve performance potential for Windows games running through Wine and Proton. Notice the careful wording there. Potential. This is not a promise that every game suddenly runs better overnight, but it is one of the more concrete under-the-hood improvements in this release, because synchronization overhead has been a real issue for some Windows titles on Linux. So if you game on Linux, especially through Steam Play, Ubuntu 26.04 is more interesting than a normal LTS release might be. Add the stronger Wayland story and the media stack improvements, and you can see why some users will be tempted to jump early. The problem is that temptation and good upgrade timing are not always the same thing, because once we move from fresh install territory into real-world existing systems, that is where the risks start to matter a lot more. This is the part where I think Ubuntu 26.04 LTS becomes a lot more interesting, because a good release is not just about what got better, it is also about what became less predictable. The first risk is simply this: if you are upgrading an existing machine instead of doing a clean install, you are carrying your history with you. That means PPAs, third-party repositories, custom drivers, niche apps, hand-tuned settings, and whatever strange decisions all of us have made over the years because something broke once and we fixed it at 1 AM with a forum post from 2019. Ubuntu's own upgrade documentation is fairly clear about the general pattern. Third-party repositories and PPAs may be disabled during a release upgrade, and if the upgrade process complains about foreign packages, that is your warning sign. In plain English, the messier your current install is, the less sensible it is to treat a brand new LTS like a casual click-and-go upgrade. Then there is Wayland. On paper, the shift makes sense. GNOME has moved on, Ubuntu has moved on, and NVIDIA support on Wayland is reportedly in a much better place. But there is a difference between the platform moving forward and every personal workflow being ready for that move. If your setup depends on X11 specific tools, older capture utilities, certain automation tricks, or desktop behaviors that never quite translated cleanly to Wayland, you need to test first and trust later. There is also a quieter change that some long-time Ubuntu users will notice immediately. The software and updates application is no longer included by default on Ubuntu desktop. You can still install it manually, but if you are used to managing repositories and update behavior through that tool, it is another example of Ubuntu changing the desktop assumptions under your feet. Again, not catastrophic, but definitely the kind of thing that makes experienced users stop and say, all right, where did they move that this time? The default app swaps can also be mildly disruptive. Papers, Loop, Tixis, and Showtime are newer and in many ways more modern choices, but newer does not always mean better for every user. If you have habits built around the old tools, or if a specific feature you relied on behaves differently, you are going to feel that immediately after an upgrade. And then we get to trust. Ubuntu Insights is replacing Ubuntu Report, and Canonical says the metrics collection is opt-in. That is an important distinction, and it should be stated fairly. Previous consent does not carry over automatically. So this is not a story of hidden telemetry being silently turned back on. But if you already have trust concerns around Canonical, Ubuntu 26.04 probably does not erase them. It mostly relocates the conversation into a new settings and consent model. The other practical caution is timing. Official Ubuntu documentation says LTS to LTS upgrades are only offered after the first point release. That is the usual pattern, and it exists for a reason. Canonical does not wait just to be annoying. It waits because early bug fixing matters, especially when millions of conservative users are supposed to treat the LTS as the stable choice. So when people ask, is Ubuntu 26.04 safe to upgrade to right now? My answer is that there are really two answers. Is it interesting right now? Absolutely. Is it automatically the best move for every 24.04 LTS machine in the first week? Not even close. And that brings us to the real recommendation, because who should upgrade depends a lot on what kind of user you actually are. So here is the practical recommendation, and I think it depends entirely on which lane you are in. If you are on Ubuntu 25.10, comfortable with change, and you like staying current, Ubuntu 26.04 LTS makes a lot of sense. You are already close to this stack, the jump is smaller, and the move to a new LTS gives you a longer support runway. For that group, I would say yes, this is a reasonable upgrade once you have a backup and a little patience. If you are on Ubuntu 24.04 LTS and your machine is a workhorse, meaning it has to function every day and you do not enjoy troubleshooting for sport, I would be more conservative. Not because 26.04 looks bad, but because the official LTS to LTS upgrade path is intentionally delayed until the first point release. That is Canonical telling you very politely that stability is still being proven in the field. If you are a gamer, the answer is a qualified, maybe leaning yes, especially if you are already comfortable fixing the occasional Linux problem. NTSYNC makes this release more attractive than a typical Ubuntu LTS for Wine and Proton users, and the broader Wayland and graphics story is clearly healthier than it used to be. But if your current gaming setup is dialed in and stable, there is still a strong case for waiting and letting the first wave of bugs hit somebody else. If you are on older or weaker hardware, I would not force this. The 6GB comfort target is telling you something. Ubuntu 26.04 is not pretending to be lightweight anymore, so if you are trying to keep an older laptop useful, a lighter Ubuntu flavor may be the smarter upgrade path than Ubuntu desktop itself. If you dual boot with Windows, especially on a newer machine with BitLocker involved, Ubuntu 26.04 is actually more promising than previous releases because Canonical has done work in that area. Still, I would back up anything important before touching the partition table, because no release note has ever saved anybody from regret after a rushed dual boot experiment. And if you are the kind of user who still depends on older X11 behavior, custom repo setups, very specific extensions, or specialist tools that do not always play nicely with major desktop changes, then my recommendation is simple. Wait, read the bug reports. Watch how the first few weeks go. Let 26.04 prove itself. So the short version is this. Fresh installs on modern hardware, quite attractive. Upgrades from 25.10, reasonable. In-place upgrades from a settled 24.04 LTS production system in week 1, that is where I would slow down. And with that said, let's wrap this up with the verdict I think most people actually need, not the one release hype usually tries to sell them. So, what is the verdict on Ubuntu 26.04 LTS? I think this is a meaningful release, not because it reinvents Ubuntu overnight, and not because every change is going to make everyone happy, but because it reflects a desktop that has moved forward in several practical ways at once. GNOME 50 brings workflow improvements that people will actually notice. The Wayland story is much more mature. The default app stack has been modernized. Media handling is better. Gaming gets a real technical boost with NTSYNC. And the dual boot and ARM work shows Ubuntu is trying to stay relevant on the kinds of hardware people are actually buying. At the same time, this release does not magically remove the usual upgrade risks. In fact, in some ways it highlights them. Ubuntu is more opinionated now. It expects newer hardware, it assumes a more modern graphics and session model, and it is less interested in preserving every old habit forever. So, if you want the simplest possible answer, here it is. Ubuntu 26.04 LTS looks like a good release. It just is not an automatic day one upgrade for everyone. If you enjoy testing, if you are already near the latest stack, or if you are doing a fresh install on decent hardware, there is a lot to like here. If you are sitting on a stable Ubuntu 24.04 LTS system that you rely on for work every single day, the smart move is probably to wait for the first point release and let the rough edges surface before you volunteer your own machine. That is not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That is just good Linux hygiene. And honestly, I think that is the most respectful way to cover Ubuntu 26.04. Not by pretending every new release deserves instant praise, and not by acting like every change is a betrayal, but by asking the only question that matters in the end. Does this make your setup better today, or would it be better a few months from now? Let me know where you land on this one. Are you upgrading to Ubuntu 26.04 LTS right away, waiting for 26.04.1, or skipping it entirely for now? And if you are already testing it, tell me what actually changed on your hardware, because that real-world feedback is always more useful than a polished release announcement.